Welcome. Today we are joined with Gary Monroe, who has written 5 books on the highwaymen and their impact on Florida. He's also delivered around 300 lectures about the highwaymen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So, the first question we have is, can you tell us a little bit about the history of the highwaymen?
Sure can. We have to go back to about 1960, maybe even the late 50s. But by 1960, 61, a group of self-taught artists formed and found a better way to make a living than working in the citrus fields and packing houses in Fort Pierce and in Gifford, Florida. They're all African Americans coming up during Jim Crow, those very mean years that kept blacks separated and unequal. And suddenly they have this energy, this youthful vigor, and this shared talent. They encouraged each other. As Marianne Carroll, the only woman of the highwaymen, said, we learn from one another's brushstrokes. So it has a nice communal ring to it. And in the process, they started selling these paintings, and they sold like wildfire, to the tune of perhaps 200,000 large oil paintings in 20 years. And they sold almost exclusively to white people. And you have to realize, too, from 1960 to 1980, which is their tenure, the population of Florida doubled. After World War II, South Florida was, or all of Florida actually, was like Southern California, if not all of California, the place to realize the American dream. During World War II, almost all of Florida was converted into a military training camp. I'm from Miami Beach. I grew up in South Beach, and I've seen photographs of young troops lining the beach for about a mile doing calisthenics in this paradise. And of course, if you survive the war, you dream of that environment, that all year long summer. And the draw was phenomenal. So between those 20 years, the place was flooded with new families and new couples and new families. And they were greeted not by the sales brochures where you put $25 down and pay $20 a month for your piece of paradise, but when they came down here, not everybody's house was on the ocean or on the intercoastal. And you might have been disillusioned by the heat and humidity or by mosquitoes and cockroaches, which are part of Florida experience. But you buy one of these glowing paintings, you put it on the cinder block wall, and it's transformed into a picture window onto paradise. It's almost a trophy of your arrival here. And hence they just kept selling it. It was calibrated to sell to new arrivals and to people that called Florida home. And at $25 a pop, these paintings were very, very affordable. And these artists who were in their late teens and early 20s then were driving Cadillacs. That was an interim goal for many of them, while Alfred Hare, who's the protagonist of the story, the sort of the de facto leader, he dreamt of being a millionaire by his 35th birthday, just when he was out of high school. And he was on those roads to riches along with some of his cohort. And they were driving mostly through South Florida, where there was more butt money than there was in North Florida. And in fact, he was thinking of moving to Hallandale in South Florida, near Fort Lauderdale in Miami. And the day before he's planning to leave, he's at Eddie's place, a juke joint, the very center of the activity in Lincoln Park, the Black community in Fort Pierce. And long story short, he was gunned down. He was shot by an irate field laborer, truck driver, for no real good reason other than jealousy. And he dies at age 29, 6 children on top of his game. But nevertheless, in 1970, nevertheless, the painters continued. There was so much centrifugal force, and they were making so much money. But things, as Hezekiah Baker, one of the painters, told me, it wasn't the same. He said Alfred was the glue that held us together. But of course, money does a good job at keeping things rolling. And come 1980, tastes had changed, cultures had changed, and the interest in their paintings waned. And they were essentially, most of them stopped painting, many of them had other jobs, etc. But those that kept painting did it for a limited audience. It's all they knew, about 6 or 7 of the artists. And they were living not high on the hog. Remember Mary Ann, when I first met her, she was living in a little dinky substandard housing, as were some of the other artists. And Jim Fitch, a gallerist and frame shop owner in Sebring, Florida, named them the Highwaymen. During their tenure, they had. I'm sorry about my lab.
No worries.
Somebody must have some food or something. The lab, and Jim names them the Highwaymen out of the blue. He goes down, he meets some of them. He's friends with one of the artists, and he didn't quite know him. Goes down there to realize what's going on and names them the Highwaymen. And that really kicked off interest with some people. Wrote an article in a magazine. And then I was writing a book about something else, and I got interested in the Highwaymen, and I talked to Jim. He says, take the ball and run with it. His interest was mostly in the economy of the artwork, how they made money. Mine was in the aesthetic of the artwork. So in 2001, the book came out and was reviewed by the New York Times, and it just blew this thing wide open. And since then, these paintings that one could find at yard sales for $3 are suddenly $30,000. So you have that thing going, but mostly it's about the aesthetic of how it's so well mirrored people's sensibility of what it meant to live in Florida. And I think it just nailed it in terms of how they painted. We refer to their painting as fast painting. Alfred was in a hurry, as were his friends. They weren't going to take 3 weeks for an oil painting. They made paintings from start to finish in 15, 20 minutes. And they're beautiful. But because they painted so fast, they're sort of sketchy, free-flowing, open for interpretation. And I think because of that, viewers were beckoned to lend their own narratives to the painting and hence have a sense of ownership in them, and became very proud of them. And over the years, as they've gotten discarded or sold, new people pick them up, and now it's a cultural phenomenon.
That's awesome. That story is one that I haven't heard before. But it's so interesting to learn about that. And one question I had, if you don't mind elaborating. So the first book you said was more about like the aesthetics that you've written, more about the aesthetics of the Highwaymen. Can you explain that a little more and what that means?
Yeah, how we value things of beauty. And aesthetics is always changing. That's what art is ultimately about. Who's added to the dialectic, to the vocabulary of what art or a painting is. Most painting, especially of that era, was somewhat prosaic or academic. I argue that the Highwaymen fit into a more of a contemporary art mode because of how they painted and hence the sense of representation that yielded, that involves the viewer so dramatically and almost offers a sense of dreaming. So people are compelled to lend their stories and take pride in the paintings. Nobody quite painted like the Highwaymen, those fast sweeps. I mean, even the way they applied the paint with palette knife or brushes was generally quick and easy and liberating. And they didn't have that ring of formal academic painting in which one looks at it and has to stay in a hush hush kind of mode, where the frame is often more valuable than the car. This was accessible art, and it was because of the aesthetic how they painted their paintings. And I think too, their distinctions as colorists. They weren't beholden to theory at all. They didn't know theory. They were untrained. Alfred had some lessons during high school from A.E. Backus, a sensational regionalist in Fort Pierce, which helped him a lot. But then when he gets out of school and starts his own career as an artist, he sort of leaves those techniques behind, sort of bastardizes these cherished concerns. And it's the color that was the most free wielding. They were not, again, beholden to theory. They applied color and the tint of the color as they felt they should. And that's why many people don't understand the paintings. They might say that's not the accurate color of a sunset. Well, it is if you live in South Florida or most of Florida. It's orange during the summer months if you look over the Everglades, where I'm from, for example. So I think if they didn't have the exact hue, they had the exact temperament of understanding, metaphorically, the experience of life in Florida. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I had one question for you is what would you say was the effect of Beanie Backus on Florida Highwaymen and Florida art in general?
I think he's the supreme regionalist. He's certainly Florida's number one regionalist. Um, I think he did a great job showing off the Florida landscape. I think it's true that he encouraged the highwaymen, and they've learned a lot from his model, both in terms of what he painted, how he painted, and how he marketed his paintings. They knew they couldn't market them the same way, that being these young black people, they weren't going to have a waiting list for paintings, they weren't going to have galleries representing them, et cetera, et cetera. But Bacchus's work, as beautiful it is, it wasn't really made for competition in New York City. He cared more about his own backyard, his own zip code, and making pleasing paintings for his neighbors that he loved. He was a loving kind of a person. I think that comes through in the paintings. Many of the artists said they didn't have much of a connection to Bacchus, and he was favored Alfred always, and a couple of the painters would visit him occasionally. But Don Brown, his studio manager, then did his best to keep them at bay from Bacchus, to keep Bacchus painting. But Bacchus is just a wonderful painter and a wonderful Floridian.
Awesome. Before we go, is there anything else that you want to add about the Highwaymen or your research in your books?
Well, just that only now, after the discovery and this resurgent interest that started in about the millennium, 20 years, 21 years ago, um, it's just now taking off beyond Florida. Now people are around the country are acquiring paintings and are showing interest in the paintings. And I think again that goes back to Florida being the dream state, state of mind. And you see these luscious tropical, subtropical paintings, and you can't help but go back to the garden, where everything comes from and everything is pristine. So I think we're going to see these celebrated more, hopefully in art museums, which I've been fighting for successfully at last, where they're not only showed at local community centers or history museums or libraries, but being scrutinized by fine arts curators. In fact, the first major exhibition was, 14 years ago at the Fort Lauderdale Museum of Art, where we compared and contrasted Harold Newton, who's sort of the most popular of the painters, against Alfred Hare, with a very different style. And it was a magnificent show, and it filled the house up. But it was the first time that people got to experience better paintings. And more recently, the Boca Raton Museum of Art, and just last few months ago, the Orlando Museum of Art curated 100 paintings from 5 major collections, which I was honored to curate. And that show is now traveling to the Tampa Art Museum and then to the Manila Museum. I'm sorry, then I take that back. It's traveling to the Tampa Art Museum, and then it goes back to the owners of the paintings. It's
Awesome.
still growing and gaining interest, and
Yeah. No, it's so interesting seeing how even though this movement was made in the 50s and 60s, like you said, it's just gaining more popularity. I think that really shows how it's lasted the test of time.
yeah, originally they were cheap decorative paintings that people wooed over, but now they're um, interesting paintings, and interesting for the right reasons, because they are aesthetically compelling, and they have been not deconstructed, but they have been made accessible to broader audiences. And of course, the money that they're getting now is never been expected. In fact, the artists were always telling me that they never saw this coming. And then you have artists too. The old story about the artist is discovered after he or she is gone. These artists are enjoying the fruits of their labor, have a renewed audience that was bigger and broader than it's ever been in the 1960s or 70s, and have renewed careers, are treated like folk heroes. There's weekend celebrations all around the state, for the last 20 years, and there's making new paintings and selling paintings like crazy. So, of course, they're older, and some of them no longer around, but over the 20 years, most of them have seen their early labor celebrated and made into part of our shared history.
That's yeah, I that's cool that it's become more of like a national thing as well.
Yeah,
But thank you, Mr. Monroe, for being with us today and sharing a little bit about the Highwaymen history, their aesthetics, and really just the massive impact that they've had on the art world.